introduce Frank Scheer.
Maybe snow will stay these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. You've all heard the hereditous slogan that's on the New York post office: neither snow nor rain nor sleet nor dark of night will stay these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Well, that's the spin-off for this particular title. What I'm going to do is cover several topics. Now, it's important that you download the notes pages that are posted on the club website, because I'm going to skip over the ones in red. But if you are interested in how research is done for post office cards that have railway post office postmarks, some of that information could be useful to you. And you may want to also then contact the Railway Mail Service Library for additional assistance. What we're going to do today is just talk about items 1, 2, and 6. We're going to talk about what the Railway Mail Service was, what the functions were in a railway post office, and then I'm going to focus most of the presentation on a real photo postcard. Now, the Railway Mail Service existed from 1864 to 1977, and that the next slide will mention a little bit of that, but there really was no logo per se for the Railway Mail Service. The badge that the clerks wore is about the closest logo there ever was, and the badge that you see was produced initially in 1899, and then they were all serial numbered. There actually was a badge number 1. I don't have it, but I think I've got badge number 8. And then it progressed serially all the way to the last badge that was produced. Something around 97,000 is a serial number. Now, that does not mean that there were only 97,000 railway postal clerks in that period from 1899 through the 1960s. As a badge, as a person retired or they left the service or whatever, they turned in their badge, it was reassigned to somebody else. And so a badge might be reused 2 or 3 times. So there were many, many more clerks than just the serial number of the badges. But this is essentially worn with pride by all the postal clerks. In the 1960s, they introduced photo identification badges. They had to wear those, but many of the clerks who were working prior to the 1960s, when those photo ID badges were issued, they continued to wear their metal badge because it was a source of pride to them. So what we're going to do in this first 2 sections, a lot of you, when you have postcards, some of you all may have seen, whether in USA or in Canada, you may have seen the letters RPO in the postmark. In Canada, they also had an MC for mail car. If you ever wondered what a railway post office is, you've come to the right place. I'm going to give you about a 5-minute sketch on that. The first experimental route for sorting mail in transit was between Hannibal and St. Joseph, Missouri in 1862. That only lasted about 9 months. I personally have never seen a postmark for that route, and there's probably good reasons why it would be rare, if any do exist, because they only sorted mail between on the trip that went from Hannibal, Missouri to St. Joseph. They did not sort mail the other way. The whole purpose of it was to separate the mail that was going on the Butterfield Overland stage. By that time, the Pony Express was history. But they separated out the mail that was going westbound on the stage towards California and other points west. Is an experimental route, lasted about 8 years. 8 months. A lot of people like to say, oh, well, that must have been the beginning of the railway mail service. It's certainly part of railway mail service history, but it wasn't until 1864, on August 28th, that the first permanent route was established, and that's between Chicago, Illinois, and Clinton, Iowa, on the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. And when they did that, they also then established the Office of the Railway Mail Service within the Post Office Department, and assigned a general superintendent over the service. Now, the last trip between New York and Washington on June 30th, 1977, was really pretty much the end. Actually, the Railway Mail Service had pretty much ended prior to that. That was the only surviving route after Amtrak started in 1971. So between 1971 and 1977, you may find postcards. Certainly, if you're collecting other covers, you're going to find quite a few that say New York and Washington RPO. Now, just a little tidbit for those who like to get into trivia. That was not really the last route that carried the route title RPO. It was brought to the attention of some of the people when they thought that the officers in the Postal Service or Post Office, I'm sorry, the Postal Service at that time said, well, there are no more RPOs. And somebody said, oh, yes, there are. There's two on Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire. They're boats. And one of them ran from Lake Winnipesaukee. It was a Lake Winnipesaukee RPO, and operated from the Weirs and then out to Bear Island and some of the other places. And then another portion of the lake, there was the, and now I'm drawing a blank on it, but the, well, anyway, that's part of trivia. But anyway, so there were two RPOs. They were discontinued on September 30th, 1978, and the other one was the Wolfboro and Marymount. So the Railway Mail Service was renamed Postal Transportation Service in 1949. If you look at postmarks, you're going to see that some postmarks after 1949 have in the killer that postmarked the stamp had the letters PTS. Prior to that, they said RMS. And of course, postmarkers that were made prior to 1949, they continued in use. So even into the 1960s, when I started getting interested in railway mail service and railway post offices, they were still using postmarkers that had the letters RMS in the killer. And then in 1960, they changed again. It became the Postal Transportation Service became the Bureau of Transportation, and things just sort of relatively disintegrated after that. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm not going back with these years. I am just referring it all as Railway Mail Service and the clerks that worked in these cars as railway postal clerks. During most of the 20th century, the railroads historically have divided their operations into divisions, and the Railway Mail Service was no different. You don't need to know this. It's not going to be on the final exam that there were 15 RMS, 15 division RMS or Postal Transportation Service divisions. But it becomes important when you are doing research, like I'm going to demonstrate in the last portion of this presentation, to know what division your service was in so that you look at the schedule to find the information that you want. There were schedules of mail routes that are described in that handout that's posted on the club website. Those were issued several times a year, beginning in 1877. They were also serial numbered and consecutive all the way from the beginning in 1877 with number 1, and then until the last one was published in the 1950s. This is an ad that appeared in the Washington Post. I'm sorry, Saturday Evening Post. That's what I get for living inside the Beltway. I keep on thinking about Washington Post. But this was in the Saturday Evening Post, and there were a whole series of these ads during World War II. In 1938, the New York Central System introduced a streamlined version of the 20th Century Limited, a very, very famous train. So what they did is they did an ad every month or 2 months about a different car on the train. Some of them showed the dining car, some of them showed the observation car. There was a car that had a barber shop in it and a secretary and so on like that, as well as the sleeping cars. The 20th Century Limited was an all sleeping car train. It was a first class train that charged extra fare, a very, very famous train. And the point of this particular ad, when they did this, there was a railway post office on the 20th Century Limited. The message that was conveyed to people is no matter how influential you were, how much you paid for your ticket, you could not go into this car. It was the exclusive use of the post office department. The other reason why I like this particular one is it's a nice cutaway view. It shows how the clerks and some of the fixtures in the car were arranged. So that's what I'm going to spend about a minute and a half, 2 minutes discussing. If you're up here, I don't know if you can see my cursor moving around. It may be very small, but in this upper right-hand area, they would stack mail that they were going to sort during the trip. And then as they worked mail, then they got down into this area, and there were 1,088 separations in these pigeonholes. Actually, they're called distribution cases. And this is where a clerk would work a section here, another clerk here, and so on like that. Each of them had a section of these distribution cases. They were all working different kinds of mail or different destinations for mail. One might be if you were going to New York eastbound on the 20th Century Limited, the one person would be sorting maybe New York City mail. Another might be sorting Albany mail. Another would be sorting Syracuse and so on. But then they were also sorting states, sorting New York State, New Jersey, and so on like that. And then making connections to other railway post offices through the New York City gateway. So there was a lot of activity right here. I'll skip over these two right here and go to this section. These are sacks. Now, a lot of parcel post was not sorted on the 20th Century Limited, but newspapers were actually a preferential item because, and for very good reason, if you subscribe to a newspaper, it was a daily or a weekly, you knew what day that newspaper was supposed to arrive in your mailbox. If it didn't arrive during this era, you would go ahead and probably complain to your congressman and say, hey, the post office department is screwing up. My paper was 2 days late. And so newspapers in particular, dated publications, received a lot of scrutiny, a lot of care, and was sorted in this area. If there was a parcel that said special handling on it, that would have been sorted here too. But that's what these folks are doing. Now they had separations, these large overhead boxes that could accommodate more mail, and it increased the amount of space in addition to all the open sacks that they could sort mail into. Coming back to these two people, these are the registered mail clerks. Usually there was one registered mail clerk, but at the time that they opened a package, they might have somebody else witness it to make sure that, when they opened it, it really only had 18 pieces, if that's what it said on the manifest. And somebody else would state, yes, when it was opened, there were 18 pieces if there was a discrepancy. They had a little bit of a sitting down job, but not much. Everybody else is standing. All these people stood essentially for the entire length of their trip, which was usually about 300 or 400 miles and over several hours, plus a couple hours maybe at the origin terminal to go ahead and get the car all set up. Then you get back over here. When they finished sorting the mail in this section, they would put it in here, or it was also mail that they would bring on in and sort. And then they call this the picker-upper, okay? It's the mail crane and the catcher arm. There were places where the 20th century and many other railway post offices make a non-stop exchange where they'd slow down a little bit, the train would slow down, but they did not stop. And so the mail was in this pouch and it was on a crane, and they'd pick it up and kick another one out for that post office. And so not every location where the train didn't stop, well, many of those did have service directly off of this and other trains. So anyway, that's why I like this picture. In the notes pages, you can read all this a little bit better. So that's a good introduction to what a railway post office is and what the people did. A railway post office enabled en route distribution, mainly of first-class letters, second-class newspapers, and fourth-class parcel posts, which had special handling or special delivery. Now, in the 1920s and 1930s, airmail service was still pretty iffy. They did not have all the air route and air traffic control equipment that you had today. They were working on beacons. If the air pilot could not see the beacons because of clouds or because of bad weather or because of snow, a lot of times the mail was diverted to the railway post office. And then registered mail, which is a service of first class, was under the care of one clerk. Now, you're not going to find very many instances where postcards were sent by special delivery. You may occasionally find a postcard that was sent by airmail, and registered mail ordinarily was not a postcard. That was usually something valuable. All the U.S. currency and coin that was going between the U.S. Treasury, Federal Reserve, between banks, that was handled as registered mail. That's one of the reasons why there are several movies about train holdups. They're looking for the registered mail because that's where the money is. Also, just a little factoid for us in the Washington, D.C. area. You all know how the Hope Diamond got to the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. It was sent as a registered mail package by Harry Winston in New York City, sent by registered mail down to the Smithsonian. $502 for postage. And that was back in the early 1950s. So if it's good enough for Harry Winston and good enough for the Hope Diamond, the registered mail was a very, very secure service because it required hand-to-hand transfers and signatures to prove every step of the way. And something went missing, the Postal Inspection Service, which is the law enforcement arm of the Post Office Department, knew where to look. Wherever it became a cold trail, that's the place to go digging around trying to find out why it didn't make that link. As I mentioned, crews of railway mail clerks, they staffed the RPOs. These were not railroad employees. They did not work for Railway Express. They were post office employees. And the average trip for most of these clerks was about 300, in some cases as much as 400 miles. And then they had, before the train even left, they would be standing there setting up the car and maybe start doing some mail distribution for a couple hours. They were on their feet for a long time. And that's one other little interesting issue is even if you see a postcard or a letter that does not have a railway post office postmark, if that letter or card was going more than 50 miles prior to the 1950s, chances are it was sorted in a railway post office. It just didn't get the postmark. You had to be mailing the letter or postcard on the train or putting it into a letterbox on the platform for pickup by that railway post office, or these railway post offices had a letter slot in the side of the car. You could slide it in there. It'd get the postmark. But 99% of the mail that was sorted in RPOs never got a postmark. But that's one of the reasons why if you have a letter or a card and you're interested in how it moved from one place to another, that's the kind of research that the Railway Mail Service Library can help you with. We do a big jump. Now we're getting into the meat, and I like railway post office cards where you could see the railway post office. And this was not a good day. And I also figured this would be a good thing to talk about during the presentation. Now, we've had a few good days here in August so far where it's not been quite so hot. If it had been back during July when we got those, it feels like 100 degrees or higher, seeing a nice snow view like this might cool everybody off. But so I got this card, and this is the challenge for a lot of post office card collectors. They come across a real photo card. These were usually only produced in quantities of just a handful, maybe only one or two. They were done on photo paper that where the photographer printed the negative, and sometimes it was a contact print. So there's usually pretty good resolution, depending upon what the camera equipment was. So everybody's out there and everybody's trying to figure out what to do. And meanwhile, I bought this card and now I'm trying to figure out what to do because it's so enticing. You know that this is engine number 102 on some railroad. You know this is a railway post office by what's said there on the left. And you can see up on the name board, which is top part here, up here, it says Ho ampersand Northern. I'm sorry, no, the ampersand's not there, but it's H-O and then Northern. So you got something to go on. You got something to try to figure out what the name of this railroad is, and then maybe figure out some other details about it. That's where we come in. You know, if this had been an identified card, it would have been worth a lot more than what I paid for it. And it took a little bit of figuring out. So here's the steps that I went through to figure out what this card is. So, and this is the backside. Nothing on there that helps you figure it out. And somebody somewhere along the way was trying to sell that for $10. I didn't pay $10 for it, but I paid more than $1. These are the primary sources that I used. And this, if you ever run into railway mail service kinds of questions in railway post offices, you're going to use very similar resources. One of us is called the Official Guide of the Railways, which has every railroad in it and has their timetables in it. A lot easier than trying to go find a public timetable for a particular railroad on a particular year if you've got a good set of these official guides. And then you look in the publication called the Schedule of Mail Trains. That's essentially what the employee timetable was for railway postal clerks. It showed all the routes, when they operated, doesn't show the time at every individual station, but it shows, you know, where the junctions were, when the train originated and left the beginning terminal, and when it ended, when it stopped at the last terminal, and so on like that, and connections that it made. And then I also, as we got into the research, was able to identify that this is in Idaho. So the RMS library has a collection of post route maps. So we're going to talk about these very briefly. In a lot more detail, all this is covered in that handout. So be sure to download the handout. So we're up there trying to figure out, oh, what's the railroad name? You can make out the H-O, Northern. So you got to look through a list of all the railroads and try to find a railroad that has Ho Northern at the back end of it. And then this was really indistinct. And now that I know what it is, it's much easier to decipher. You couldn't really make out some of the letters very well, but you could tell that in the second position, there was an ampersand. So whatever it was a letter, ampersand, couple more words, and then maybe railroad, maybe railway. And could it be the Pacific and Idaho Northern? Well, let's find out. So I went through the official guide, and all that you do with this is you just go through and you just scan down the list one at a time, look at every railroad that existed. And I just picked something around 1900 and 1910 because that's for real photo postcards. That's about the era that most of them were produced. You know, it had the railway post office was behind the tender. So by going down in this 1910 official guide, I hit pay dirt, I thought, or initially, enough to pursue, when you find that there was a railroad called the Pacific and Idaho Northern, and it was on page 717. Now, that's in the index, so that's the only railroad name that satisfies the criteria of having HO and an ampersand in the second position. Turn to a schedule of mail routes. I figured out where the Pacific and Idaho Northern was. It's out in Idaho. Well, what a surprise that is, but it operated a segment from Weiser up to Evergreen. And it was a short line railroad, only had a train that operated once each day in each direction. You know, less than about 70 miles altogether. Now, I could not tell you where on that line the snow derailment occurred. Now, and a snow derailment occurs because the snow is so deep that all of a sudden the wheels and the flanges come off the track. And this railroad, if you look at the schedule here and you look at the times and the distance, you can pretty much figure out 25 miles an hour was top speed for this train, and maybe even less. So when it came off the track, it wasn't a catastrophe. You know, it basically stayed upright like you saw in that initial picture. We then investigate a little further in the schedule of mail routes. And so the trains left out of Weiser and went up to Evergreen. Then they turned around and came back. It was a 20-foot apartment car. A 20-foot apartment car fits what I see in the photograph. That's not something I would expect you to see. But if you look above that red circle or red oval, you see that there are two clerks that were associated with this route, O.I. Ellis and Victor Dickey. Going back to that picture, this person here might be one of those people. This person here is probably another one. One got off the car to see how badly damaged the RPO car was, and the other one's trying to figure out, well, what are they going to do? If I did enough genealogical research, you could find some other pictures of clerks taken at the time. I might be able to figure out which one is which. I did not pursue that, but this is all the possibilities that you have with a real photo postcard if you do the research. This visually gives you an idea of where the route is. This is where that post route map comes into play. They connected with the Oregon short line at Weiser, and then just ran to really sort of the end of the line at New Meadows and Meadows. And from there was a stage route that it connected with. So this part of Idaho is rural, and it's mountainous, and it's prone to snow in the winter. So this is probably not an unusual occurrence for a little short line railroad like this to have derailments in the snow. They probably did what they could to try to operate in the winter, and sometimes it didn't work out. I tried looking in newspapers. Now that I know it's in Idaho and there's a big snowfall, well, I didn't find anything for that particular railroad because it probably derailed so often that all the people didn't regard that as news. All they did was look out their window and says, there's 5 feet of snow outside. I guess the train's not going to run today or tomorrow or next week. You know, that's the way it was back then. You didn't expect to get the daily delivery of mail. So, but it did have this article that apparently in Montana, and Montana's not that far from Idaho, that you had a severe storm and all the railway trains were at a standstill. They were all snowed in. Whether it's this storm or whether it's another storm, I'll never know. But this starts pinning it down to probably that this might be a 1910 photograph. And of course, in the notes, you can read all of that. It tells you about what was going on to try to get the trains running and the problems. People were really stranded on trains for days. Now, the same photographer, I did not see this photograph until much later on, after I did a little more research. The photographer took a picture on one side and then did a real photo postcard on the other side. This one, the P and IN is very, very clear. If I had started with this, it would have been a piece of cake to determine what the road is. And you could see if you look at the other picture that I had in this one, it's the same view, same day, because the way this tender is tilted this way, RPO cars sort of off the track this way, and it's all the same. Can't tell you exactly where it was, but it was somewhere in there in the Idaho mountains. If you have a postcard that has Evergreen and Wiser, this is the postmark that would have been applied back in 1910. It looked like this. Railway Post Office postmarks had the letters RPO at the bottom. And then this right here, TR2, that means train 2. So this was sorted on December 17th, 1910 on train 2. The clerk in charge of the Railway Post Office had this postmark, and not very many letters or postcards were postmarked on the Evergreen and Wiser. This is a nice clear postmark. Sometimes you'll see postmarks on postcards where they're smeared, or the word postcard here interferes with your ability to read some of the lettering. But if the postcard had been mailed on the Railway Post Office that day, this is about probably what the postmark would have looked like. We reach a conclusion. My point to all of you is that sometimes you're going to find a postcard that has a lot of potential. Maybe doesn't have a lot of information recorded on it. It becomes a detective game, trying to figure out what it is. Sometimes you're successful. Sometimes it's a cold case and it's going to stay that way forever. And, fortunately, this cold case about a snowfall derailment didn't stay a cold case. But you can do a lot of information. There's probably only a very few number of Pacific and Idaho Northern photographs that exist. So it's a very rare card. And, with the proper documentation, it becomes much more valuable than it was when I purchased it. But that's a sweat equity that I put into it by doing the research and finding the answers. So even though the Railway Mail Service Library does not purchase cards for the purpose of enhancing their value, that's what I essentially have done with this research. It's not for sale. It stays in the collection because I've written an article about it, and I like to keep the original card with the article. But it's a moment literally frozen in time. Cold day, cold photograph, it's frozen in time, that moment. And it gets the attribution that it deserves. So it's an example. I'm giving you an example of what can be done with some postcards, especially real photo postcards, where you're lacking some documentation. And with that, we got the questions, so I guess people can unmute themselves, and if somebody wants to go through the chat window and see what it is, we'll talk about that.
I have a couple of questions that came onto chat. First thing was from Carrie. Does your museum have the picker-uppers?
It's got a mail crane and it's got a catcher arm. Doesn't have the car to go with it. My conclusion is when you have a piece of railroad equipment outside, it's going to rust away. It's much easier to deal with a display that shows the mail crane and a catcher arm. But what I do have in the museum is I've got a DVD. Some of the videos are on YouTube now because people bought the DVD and decided, oh, well, I'm going to stick that on YouTube with my name on it. But anyway, that demonstrate how mail was exchanged from a railway post office using the catcher arm and the mail crane. So, yeah, it's got one.
The next question is from Glenn. It says, did the RPO have their own zip code?
No, they were not a delivery unit. First of all, zip codes did not come along till 1963. And for those who are maybe less familiar, the letters, the acronym ZIP stands for Zone Improvement Plan. Back in World War II, they were getting a lot of people because a lot of the mail clerks had to go overseas and fight the war. They had a lot of people coming on into postal positions to sort mail. And for major cities such as Chicago, New York, think of any big city, they started establishing zones. So a less experienced clerk could stand at a case and just look for any letter that had a zone number for that city and put it there, and that would identify what station or branch that letter has to go to. And then a more experienced distribution clerk would handle it. So no, and then what happened in 1963, the zip code, the Zone Improvement Plan, they came up with a hub and spoke arrangement to replace railway post offices, where all the mail would go into a centralized sorting center at the hub. And so, for example, Baltimore was a sorting hub, Washington, D.C. was a sorting hub, and then other cities like Fredericksburg, Stanton, down in Shenandoah Valley. They changed that a little bit, but the first three digits identified those locations. And then all the post offices after that, in alphabetical order, received 01, 02, 03, 04. So for Boyce, 226 was Winchester, Virginia. Then 20 was Boyce. And then later on, they made it even more fancy by adding 4 additional digits. So zip plus 4, I'm sorry, 2 additional digits. No, zip plus 4. So, and then they added 2 more digits, so it got into the delivery sequence. So actually a zip code now is 11 digits. Most people only use the 9-digit zip code, or more frequently just the 5-digit zip code. But it's amazing to me how the mail processing equipment can scan all this information, look it up in a database, and know how to route a letter faster than you can wink your eye.
Thank you. The next question, also from Glenn, where the lake Winnipeg Sauke, I don't pronounce it properly, probably, lounges consider RPOs?
Well, they're for a while there, they didn't know what else to call them, even though there were boats, steamboats, and they were waterbound. They went ahead and called them railway post offices. No wheels underneath them, no tracks. I actually did a separate presentation and article about steamboats on the Chesapeake Bay. I focused on the steamboats that were steamboat RPOs that maybe operated out of Baltimore, but they were going to the lower part of the bay down to Norfolk, Newport News. Some of them went to Richmond, various cities like that. And then, but there were quite a few that operated out of Baltimore that went to northern points in the Chesapeake Bay. Baltimore was a real hub for mail transportation by boat. And it was really it must have been a nice service. I wish I could step back in time about 70 years or 80 years and be able to take a boat leaving Baltimore at about 7 o'clock at night, have dinner on board, sleep in a cabin, and wake up in Norfolk, Virginia the next day. You know, it was sort of like an inland cruise.
It was a
But that's, yeah, there we go. That, and initially there were also highway post offices that when they first established those, they didn't know what to call those. So they were railway post offices, but they had rubber tires. Later on, they after 1941, they started using the letters HPO, Highway Post Office, for that, and established a separate service.
Ashley made a comment that her haha moments to learn that not all letters in the train were marked RPOs. Because
Well, yeah, 99% of the letters passing through our railway post office did not get the RPO postmark. They just sorted it and went on. The times that they would get an RPO postmark was if it was special delivery, they turn it over and backstamp it to show where it was sorted. If a card or letter was missent to that railway post office in error, they would mark it missent and put the postmark on there so that the person who received it could understand why it took a day longer for that letter to get to them, because it was missent in error to that particular railway post office. But otherwise, if you did not put your letter through the slot or your postcard, or you did not, there were some stations that had a letter collection box on the platform. And those were usually some junctions where they had the train would come in and be there for 5 or 10 minutes, enough time for the clerk to get off and go and what they called tap the box, open it up and take the mail out and bring it back to the car and postmark it. Except for those examples, mail was not postmarked in the railway post office. It just passed through it.
okay.
The better way to think
you.
about it.
There are no more questions on the chat, but it's open to anybody who had question now. Unmute yourself if not done and ask your question.
My name's John Conley, and thank you for a fascinating presentation. I live on Kent Island, which is right across from Annapolis. And beginning in 1901, the steamboats would leave Baltimore, come to Love Point at the top of Kent Island. The mail would go onto a train, and the train would go as far as Lewis, Delaware. I'm the docent at the post office at our Heritage Society in Stevensville. I'm just curious, at what point, how did the mail remain secure on a train that was going to stop 30 or 40 places and probably pick up mail and drop off mail at each place? And I can't wait to see your article, Steamboats on the Chesapeake Bay.
Okay, well, that one, because it's north of Baltimore and wasn't going to a destination in Maryland, I didn't treat that specifically. However, I have schedules for that steamboat. It was the Baltimore and Eastern Railroad.
Right.
So everything, mail, when it was sorted, there was 2 steps. The clerks would tie out a group of letters into what they call a letter package, maybe about 25 or 30 letters tied up. Had a facing slip on top of it that said what was in that stack of mail. Then it was put into a pouch. The pouch for first class mail was locked. So when they were not transferring individual letters or groups of letters, it was all in a pouch, however many pouches. And so when it came on, when you had the mail coming out, let's say it came out of the Baltimore post office and was going to
Delaware.
Yeah. Then what they would do is they'd be making up a pouch for that railway post office title, or maybe made up a direct pouch all the way for Lewes, and they would put that onto a cart, because later on it was a truck, but you had horse-drawn carts taking the mail down to what's now the Inner Harbor, that whole Light Street area has changed dramatically, of course, you know, that's where all your steamboats were. And so if they put it on the steamboat, go across the bay, and then get transferred at that dock on the other side, and went onto the train, all in a locked pouch. So they had either steamboat or railroad employees that were responsible for making those transfers. And then when it got onto the Baltimore and Eastern Railroad, there was a railway post office car in the earlier days. Later on, they discontinued that. They'd open up the pouch. Everybody had the same key, could open up every pouch in the country. You could take that mail key and go out to California and open up a pouch. So they'd open up the pouch, they'd sort the mail and make up, if it wasn't already made up for lose, they would do that. And then, so then it was going on to another ferry, you know, from, I can't remember if that's Ocean City or where it is, but wherever it is, it goes across over to Luz. So
Great.
maybe I'm confusing that.
No,
with,
there's
I
a
have to get my map out.
there's another ferry in Lewis that then goes from Lewis, Delaware, across into New Jersey.
Yeah, that's right. It goes Cape May to
Cape May.
Luz. Okay, that's where I'm tripping myself up. You see, the problem is you all don't have this problem. I'm 73 years old, you know, and I start forgetting things. If I'm not looking at a book, oh, there it says what it is. Freehanding it, you start getting into some sketchy information. You know. Anyway, yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right.
Thank you.
That whole thing was a fascinating service, you know, all that stuff coming out of Baltimore, going across the bay, and then everything on the Delmarva Peninsula was like its own little island of activity.
Absolutely. Still is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I had one, Clarissa.
Okay,
Just,
Andrew.
just to clarify, yeah, Andrew from Toronto. Just about when you can expect to see the RPO cancel. So if you're actually on the train, because that's pretty common with the postcards, is they were written by people sitting on the train who had nothing else to do, would be writing postcards that they bought, you know, from the tuck shop or whatever on the train. If you mailed it right on the train, that would get an RPO cancel?
They'd have to, here's how that usually works. Usually what they do is they give it to the porter of the car or the conductor. And during a station stop that was long enough, the porter or the conductor or the whatever would walk up to the front of the train and put it through the letter slot on the RPO car. Very rarely did a lot of the passengers get off the train and go up to the front of the train. Now you could be standing at a lot of people knew. First of all, that's how I got into this, because my parents, I had a pen pal in northern Maine. And my dad said, well, you know, if you go down and you mail the letter on the train, it'll get there faster. That didn't take very much arm twisting for me to go down to a train station and watch trains come on in, you know. So anyway, but by that time, the letter slots were sealed because they had a situation where a car didn't have a sealed letter box. There's a little flap that closes it on the inside. They forgot to do that. Somebody put a letter in there. That car sat in a railroad yard for 6 months. And then next thing you know, somebody found this letter. They decided, no, we can't have that anymore. You know, this was towards the end when a lot of cars were coming out of service. That's one example, though. You'll also find postcards where you got the traveling salesman. And the traveling salesman is arranging their visits for whatever product they're selling. They're thinking about the next town down the road or 2 or 3 towns down the road. Says, I'm going to be in your town on such and such, you know, I'll show you my catalog. You know, please have an order waiting for me. Hint, hint, you know, make that worthwhile. And so they would be sitting there on the train with their own, I guess they were just private postcards. They weren't necessarily picture postcards. They were usually the advertising for that particular product that they were trying to sell. And you see a lot of RPO postmarks on that. You know, that's how they were booking their appointments, especially in small towns at the general stores. Vacationers, go to Lake Placid, you know, had a skiing holiday, want everybody to know back home how it was. At Lake Placid, at the railroad depot, there was a letter box on the platform. Go ahead and pop your card in there. Went out on the next train. So several different ways in which that occurred. For me, you had to bang on the door until somebody opened it up because the letter slot was sealed. And that's what led one thing to another for me, because after a while, they kept on having this young kid who was about 16 at the time, maybe 17, banging on the door every other night. They start to remember me and I start to remember them. And that's how I got interested. My interest is really more the people who worked in the railway post offices and how they did their work than it is the postal markings, which a lot of collectors focus on. The other thing that you need to realize is there's a tremendous amount of mail. More mail actually moved as what was called closed pouch in storage mail cars. You probably are not looking at pictures of passenger trains, but there are some where it looks like there's 20 baggage cars. People call them baggage cars. You don't have 20 cars of baggage going from one town to another. One car is enough. That's storage mail, that's railway express. People just are not very precise in what they're calling it. So a lot of your mail never went into a railway post office car. Major post offices like Chicago and New York and so on like that, they were making direct pouches that were going into these storage mail cars and going over to Chicago and then being unloaded and then going into the railway post offices that left, let's say, out of Chicago. So, but the short answer, that's how you find, you almost always find if it's a picture postcard, it's a vacationer. They're usually, they're not talking about the railway post office. They just posted it on, or the train. They said, "Oh, I just had a wonderful time here on the beach. You know, I love the Outer Banks, you know, or I'll be home next week," that kind of stuff.
Well, I would point out that the RPO markings in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s would not be on picture postcards, but they would be on postal cards.
That's true. That's true. And of course, you know, you had the undivided back era where, you know, you were not supposed to write on the address side at all. And so people were sort of scribbling a little message on the picture side, you know. There's a whole era we could go into a lot about, and I'm not going to really focus on that. But yes, postal cards were one of the important things to remember, whether it's postal cards or post cards, private mailing cards, postcards, is that in an era before you had telephones, you had the opportunity for the cost of the card, which is usually a penny, the cost of the postage stamp, which is another penny, to tell somebody in the down 30 miles away that you're going to be there this evening and have dinner ready for them. Okay. And then if there was enough frequency of service between those points, they'd get the card and they could reply in the same day, and you get that coming back. That's a really nice specialty to try to collect, is where you get, and usually you only see one side of the conversation. If you find a card where somebody saved both the message up and the message coming back, you know, that I think makes its own story, because I can tell you what train it ran on, what the schedule was, how close the connection was, and then, you know, they almost had to be standing at the post office. They knew when the mail came in, they'd be standing at the post office. They get the card. Oh, well, most of these are general stores. They got a postcard rack. Spend a penny, which has a different connotation in England. Okay. And they go ahead and get a postcard off the rack, get a stamp off the, from the post office, write this reply, give it to the postmaster, go out in the next dispatch, and it would get back to the origin. And if you don't know what spend a penny means in England, then there's somebody else that you can ask about that.
Was
I
the
like to,
U.S.
I like to have cliffhangers.
was the U.S. the only country that had railway post offices?
No, and for my friend in Canada, the main post office route was the M&T, Montreal and Toronto. And they had a variety of other RPO routes around the country too. Great Britain had a very extensive network, all centered on London. Trains that went to London, towards London, they were called down. I'm sorry, they were up. Okay. There was the down special, the up special. Okay. And it was a traveling post office. They called theirs traveling post offices. So if you get a British card and you see TPO, that's the same thing as an RPO. And it might say Crewe and Cardiff or something like that. But the up and down special were a very, very special train. It was so famous they made a movie about it back in 1936. It ran up to from London to Aberdeen, Scotland. Germany had an extensive RPO network. Just about every country you can think of had a railway post office network, whether it was very extensive or not. And you'll find example in France, they're called ambulantes, I guess. I can't pronounce it right. Spain, same way. In Spain, Couriers. If you find a Mexican card, it says Couriers. You've got a railway post office card in your hand. And most countries have gotten rid of their railway mail service, except for one. Anybody got a guess on what country that is? We're not very friendly with them right now. Russia.
North Korea.
Russia. Well, North Korea is so secretive. Who knows what they got operating in their country? But Russia still has railway post offices with clerks sorting mail in them. Now, maybe that indicates that they're behind the times. I'm not sure. But one of the things that I do, this right here, you can sort of see it. I collect these. Some people collect postage stamps. I collect the steel postmarking hand stamp that's used to cancel this letter. Okay. And I don't have one within reach. Now, this is a Canadian one. This is from Hamilton, Manitoba. Okay. You can't read it. But anyway, where did I put it? Here it is. I have to hold it down over myself. This is a postmark from a Soviet Union, USSR railway post office. I could go on for a long time, and you don't want that. This is a short meeting. I appreciate the opportunity. I want to thank everybody for your patience.
I have one more comment. It says
Okay.
that Richard says that he saw a mail picked up on the fly at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, on the Reading RR Railway.
Yes.
And the local patch kicked off.
That's right. If you're one of the very few people that actually has seen a nonstop exchange. Now, I will say that there's a railroad museum in Union, Illinois, outside of Chicago, where they have a railway post office car. They've got a mail crane. They've got a railway post office car. They got the whole shebang. And in the first weekend in June, they will reenact nonstop mail exchanges. You take all the pictures you want. So if you want to relive that experience, you go on up to Union, Illinois. It's called the Illinois Railway Museum. You can find their webpage and read all about it. It's called RPO Days. The trouble is, it was originally designed for railway postal clerks. Now, I'm 73. Most of the railway postal clerks that I knew were 20 or 30 years older than me. And so very, very few of them turn up at this event now, but it's still, you can climb in the car if you want to actually catch the mail. They'll let you climb in the car and let you do a mail exchange. So, of course, it's pretend, but you know, it's the best you can get in 2024 or next year in 2025. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the thanks is to you. I really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit of the Railway Post Office story and how it pertains to postcard collecting. Just keep that in mind. You get a real photo postcard, you're not sure about it. If it's got trains on it, I might be able to help you. Now, if it's a real photo postcard of some people at a picnic or whatever, chances are there's not much I can do. But you never know. If you have any questions, you know where to come now. So with that, I'm going to say thank you all very much. All right. Well, good night, everybody, and thank you again for attending.
Thank you very much for giving this talk. It was fascinating, as you
Awesome.
can see from the discussion. So thank you very much, Frank. And maybe we'll see you again on Zoom one of these days. You're always welcome.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Thank you so much.